KrmaL is one of the few creators in this game that has always shown a desire and drive to make himself stand out from the rest. And given the popularity of his projects, I think it's fair to say he achieves this. Considering that he's slowed down significantly in his overall interest in the game as of late, now is probably the best time to look back at his work and give my thoughts on it. I've only included what I feel to be his serious and finished projects, since they have very clearly different aims to something like Big Boned. And regardless, I doubt anyone would find me meticulously analysing a joke level to be in the spirit of what they were going for. Sorry to disappoint all of you who are expecting an in-depth breakdown of the narrative progression of Hungry Humphrey, but maybe you can find solace in the fact that I do genuinely like it. Although probably not to the extent that I prefer it over what I would consider to be the worst end of KrmaL's more serious levels, even when I have more of my fair share of criticisms to give something like High. Although this level was clearly never intended to be anything grand, the lack of any coherent theme or even a consistent style makes High a lot less memorable than some of KrmaL's other work. It feels like he had really strong ideas for a colour scheme and effect concepts to match the song's drop, but every other part just doesn't feel at all cohesive with this. Even so, every part still makes excellent choices towards working with the song through the gameplay or isolated colour schemes, the first part being a very good example of this. The simple three-tone colour scheme provides a good base to be built on when paired with the music, and while there's only a few meaningful changes in the style while those colours are present, they're effective enough to work with what's happening in the music that they don't fail to meet an expectation. The problem comes with the transition into the next part, where the style and colour scheme abruptly shift to something entirely different. While this could be justified under the reasoning that it's done to emphasise the change in the song, I feel that sacrificing coherency for the sake of fulfilling this aim was a poor choice, especially considering I don't think the song changes enough to justify it anyway. The lack of cohesion with the colour scheme into the next part also causes some issues for me. The progression from red to orange seems like a choice that was fairly detached from building up to the drop, considering that the latter is generally considered to be a less intense colour. To be fair, this is a minor critique at most. The colour difference is offset by how they're used, with the pre-drop using red as a highlight to contrast the darkness while the drop uses orange as the main base for its blocks and backgrounds. And because it was such a small detail in the level that was clearly meant to be made fairly casually, it would be pretty unfair to suggest it's the reason why it ruins the level, or anything close to that. I'm not treating it as such, but to me it's just another part of the same issue of there not being too much thought into the overall coherency of the colour scheme. At the very least, the gameplay of High still feels special, meaning that although it's my least favourite KrmaL solo, it's definitely not bad by any means. The very first part, the pre-drop, and the last part are all built around the concept of simplistic ideas that are made unique by their uncompromising nature. What I mean by that is that it seems like once KrmaL had an idea that he liked, he stuck with it, refusing to change it to make it more accessible because he was aware that doing so would weaken it, something that is most obvious in the pre-drop. The clear idea here is for the player to rely entirely on sync and muscle memory to pass the part, and as such KrmaL deliberately restricts your vision and doesn't give you any other hints as to the timing of your inputs. It's something that makes the gameplay feel very fresh even today, given how much the average level wants to hold the player's hand through every single click, and how little creators seem to want to branch out in their gameplay choices. Although I've talked a lot about the failures of the colour cohesion, the way the level opens up into the drop is still particularly impressive. The game modes, the movements, and the effects all serve to make the level feel sharp and snappy, a choice that contrasts particularly well with the more calculated and drawn out nature of the final ship. Decoration wise, this last part certainly isn't anything remarkable, but without a doubt it's the most efficient way to create disparity between itself and the part before it. And since the simplism works to fulfill this aim, I don't think there's much worth criticising about the lack of detail, a sentiment that can, funnily enough, be directly and equally applied to EXO. EXO's placement was probably the one I struggled most on while making this video. 1.0 styled levels or layout styled levels or whatever you want to call them have never appealed to me. Similarly to 9 Circles levels, the original or popularizer, in this case being aaasfhgjdfj, is what I consider to be the best iteration of the style, and I don't particularly love aaasfhgjdfj or the original 9 Circles. Whenever I see one of these levels, I always just think about how it could have looked if it didn't use the most basic blocks in the game in abundance, and I very rarely feel that the use of these objects does the level any service. I can understand that the idea of the simplicity in the designs of these levels is most likely to put emphasis on the effects, but since aaasfhgjdfj came out, all the effects present in these levels have felt very much derivative of that. And so more often than not, I don't find they're worth putting much emphasis on. As a result, the choice to build something in this style nearly always comes off as lazy, especially combined with the watch time these levels accrue, commercializing the style to the point where they conversely begin to lose all artistic value in favour of making numbers more numbery. Despite being previewed far before this trend began to surface, I, like many others, couldn't help but be disappointed by what we got to see of EXO back in 2018. KrmaL was known for being the guy that never adhered to standards, never did what was expected of him, and certainly never took the easy route for his creations. And the reveal of a project that appeared to go against this was shocking to many, to the point where confusion developed around whether the preview was even finished. The unfortunate timing of the level's verification merely a month after the release of lfnull also lended credit to people seeking to bash the level. And for more than a year after its release I played into this, seeing it as little more than another low effort, difficult level released by a creator who I was used to expecting more from. However, over time and with increased exposure to people with more varied opinions on the level, I've definitely come to like it more. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, I no longer view the decision to make it layout styled as one made out of laziness, and any criticism of it on that basis would require KrmaL to have an entirely different vision for the level, and for me that makes it worth very little. The vision that KrmaL had for this level simultaneously subverts both his style and our expectations of it, and while that doesn't necessarily make it good, it certainly gives it more valuable intention than just being the easy way out. What does make it good is the gameplay. As I've said, EXO was conceptualized far before any of the modern effect layout levels, but what separates it from them even today is that the thing that the creator intends to emphasize actually deserves the focus. In EXO, it's the gameplay that KrmaL seeks to highlight, and it works because this is some of KrmaL's best gameplay to date. It feels like thought was put into each individual click to make them all work with the music and flow together as well as possible, and to me at least this makes it very satisfying to explore and pull off. I think EXO also is a perfect example to show how, despite being so different, all of KrmaL's levels share a common thread that makes them instantly identifiable. In spite of being the worst person ever, Riversiver's point about KrmaL gameplay having a certain roughness to it was a good way of conceptualizing that common thread, because it literally captures the essence of KrmaL's style consistently going against the grain. To go deeper than that though, this roughness is generated specifically by the unique way KrmaL structures his gameplay, with orbs in particular being used to generate fresh momentum that has become typical of his style. Despite everything I have to say about the gameplay, EXO is still low on this list because I think there's a good amount holding it back visually within the context of what it's trying to be. The main problem is that effects play a very different role in the first half compared to the second, with the highlights of the first half focusing on adding subtle depth to the level, while the second half seem more like a focal point and thus attempt to be more complex. While one could argue that this is to build some sense of progression, I don't think it works too well because the most complex effects aren't properly built up to by the rest of the level. The only part that I feel manages to pull this off is the contrast between the two sync parts, but that's because it being only two parts makes it pretty much impossible to mess up progression. This progression issue is something you can find in KrmaL's other work, and it's a shame because when you have such strong potential for a narrative or the opportunity to take advantage of the length of your level as well as the clear skills to create it, it feels disappointing to never truly capitalize on it. This particular aspect is where falling up falls down. Presenting a narrative purely through visual means in order to let the player figure it out for themselves is the best way to go about it in my opinion, since it detaches the creator's specific intention from their work and allows individual interpretation to flourish. But I feel like KrmaL doesn't really express this through the level's progression as well as he could have done, with almost every part feeling isolated from the next and most seeming to have the sole intention of reflecting the music. This isn't a bad thing per se. Parts like the city are still perfectly suited to the tone of the song and therefore pull you into the world that KrmaL attempts to create. What's frustrating is that the last two parts perfectly execute both a narrative and visual transition while still working very well with the music, where the rain and gloominess progress into rainbows to emphasize the climax of the song and give both drop parts a sense of power. This just isn't the case for every other part in the level. The only transition before the last duel that makes any real sense for the level's progression is the one from the skyscrapers to the more grounded buildings. The others either feel one-sided, managing to transition into the next part successfully while failing to build off the previous part, or just kinda lazy. Despite this, I think because of the level's length and because the best parts are at the end, it does still end up feeling like a complete experience, and it's not something that takes away all value from the level itself. Falling Up is still a great level, and I feel that the main reason for this is that it has aged excellently. Some of the execution certainly doesn't match up to today's standards. There are certainly better skyscraper designs than these, but quite honestly, I do not care when the ideas presented are far more interesting to discuss than the minor flaws in the way they were executed. For example, the city part may look outdated with its flat art style and amateur shading, but the level of interactivity it provides makes it far more involving and memorable than a mere background, however pretty it may look. I particularly like the use of gravity changes in the first section, which create a smooth and almost graceful exploration of the environment, and one of course can't fail to mention the subtle upward movement of the second half falling in line with the level name. From the section it's also clear that thought was put into every individual element of the part. It seems like KrmaL resisted filling space with random air deco because it ultimately detracts from the sense of exploration by reminding you that you are in fact playing a Geometry Dash level. That's not to say air decoration can't have thought put into it. Every object in every level has a reason why it exists. But when the reason for placing an object, or indeed choosing not to, is due to wanting to achieve a thematic aim rather than just because you think it would make your level look less empty, I can respect it far more. This is one of the reasons why I think people should try to stick to the object limit a lot more than they do currently. Falling Up exemplifies how it's perfectly reasonable to fulfill the aims of your level without making it hell to play for those with worse equipment, as well as being an engaging experience despite the way it looks. I think a lot of the engagement you get from Falling Up is also down to the song, and at this point it's probably worth mentioning how KrmaL uses music in general in order to set his work apart. The obvious factor is that the songs he picks are the first use of it in game, but just as importantly, KrmaL always gets the most out of the song that he can. You wouldn't dream of a KrmaL level ending at a drop, for example. This choice creates a tendency for the player to inextricably link the song and the level together in their mind, and while this may not be so good for comment sections, it certainly helps the levels become more memorable, especially given KrmaL's focus on doing the song justice through a particular style of gameplay, which in itself has caused a lot of debate that means people are sure to remember what he makes, whether they actually like it or not. The gameplay of Lit Fuse, for example, is without a doubt some of the most controversial KrmaL has ever made, and I can honestly see why. The level is laid out so that each part focuses on a different decoration and gameplay concept, and while each one is unique from one another and from other levels, because of the nature of the song they all last for a good while. I can see this being a problem particularly because of the type of gameplay that you're presented with in each section. Once you figure out that the ship's height is linked to the pitch of the song, that's really just it for the whole part, and the style of gameplay in such long form can feel a bit monotonous to play. However, this choice for me is one that I feel adds immensely to the level rather than reducing its value. The ship and duel parts in particular have this absolutely perfect balance of requiring constant input from the player without them having to put too much thought into what they're actually doing. That results in them being lulled into a trance as the level progresses. Then you reach a drop and everything is shattered. I'm going to need a few moments to address the drop on its own because in my opinion it's what makes Lit Fuse so special and is undoubtedly one of the best progression systems KrmaL has ever built. Firstly, the gameplay. While the previous gameplay had elements of visual and click sync, they never quite worked in tandem, and with the desire to create that trance, they never really went beyond their patterns. In contrast, the drop of Lit Fuse is constantly breaking its repetitivity in order to highlight individual notes of the music or otherwise subverting the repetitivity of the pre-drop through the added emphasis on using player movement to sync with the song. Decoration-wise, this drop has no reason to work as well as it does, mostly because the style change should feel completely out of place. In this case though, it just works. The detached structuring and huge background set piece is an incredible way to open up the level after such a closed off and tied down pre-drop, something which is emphasized by the subtle flickering shadows. It's probably one of the best energy releases I've ever seen in this game, if not the best. Not only does it stand alone in what it attempted to do at the time, but it also justifies the monotony of the pre-drop in doing so. The whole level is built around hypnotizing the player into a full sense of security with soft rainbows and repetitive gameplay, before capitalizing on the slow burn to deliver one of the best climaxes this game has ever seen, and I absolutely love that KrmaL was able to pull this off in such a way that any attempts to repeat it fall flat. The reason for this is perhaps in light of Lit Fuse's raw experimentation. It comes back to what I was saying earlier about the uncompromising nature of KrmaL's style giving it a certain edge. And especially back then, it caused a stir among players and creators alike. The style of the gameplay was incredibly fresh back then and has remained so even today because people simply never try anything like it. It's arguable that you can see some of its roots in modern levels with a focus on pattern breaking, but overall KrmaL's ideas have not been adopted into the mainstream creating scene, and I'm somewhat glad for it given the amount of skill it takes to make that gameplay flourish. I'm convinced that there will never be a level quite like Lit Fuse. The exhilaration of finally getting past the duels and climbing the slope towards the drop is unlike anything I've ever felt, and the level knows what it's doing in this regard by building the entire experience around destroying your expectations. Lit Fuse unfortunately comes across to me as a very 2.0 project. I just don't think that in the current creating climate it would be possible for this level to get anywhere near the amount of exposure it did back in the day, primarily because of the current size of the player base which leads to levels like these not sticking out as much as they might have 5 years ago. One thing that certainly hasn't changed since those days is the number of people willing to provide ignorant criticism for levels they take at face value. Although back in the time that KrmaL was releasing work fairly consistently, there was definitely a lack of a more reasonable group to shut it down. With something like Black Blizzard, this issue became obvious, predominantly through assessment of the gameplay that didn't extend beyond a desire for it to be difficult, when that was clearly a secondary focus behind its actual quality. The focus on quality is not only present in the gameplay, quite obviously since it came out on top. You might be wondering how Black Blizzard came to be the better level after everything I had to say about Lit Fuse, and it's because for me it takes all the best aspects of KrmaL's previous levels, solves all the issues that were holding them back, and manages to do this without diluting the actual ideas themselves. The first thing that is perhaps the most obvious is the theming. KrmaL's themes are generally pretty abstract. XO is focused around simplicity in order to emphasize the gameplay, Lit Fuse relies on breaking its own consistency, and Falling Up makes you fall up. Sometimes. Black Blizzard is arguably KrmaL's first proper attempt at theming in the sense of tying it to an empirical concept rather than something more nebulous. And while KrmaL's lack of practice in this field might have resulted in the level feeling distracted from its aims, I think in this case it serves to provide a much more identifiable interpretation of the theme. The level is not tied as rigidly to the concept it's trying to reflect as it might have been from any other creator, and therefore it keeps some of its connections to KrmaL's style rather than attempting to switch styles altogether. This approach certainly works better in some areas than others, as the more effect-based parts can feel somewhat distant from the theme, in terms of a lack of reasonably identifiable art or set pieces. But even then, this is consistent atmosphere tying this level together. The level feels like it constantly has this fog hanging over it. It feels distant and yet still pulls the player in, and it's this that makes even the most out-of-place effects work within the context of the level's theme. If it sounds like I'm being too abstract with my explanation of how this level achieves what it's going for, it's because the level is constructed in such a way that talking about the specifics of how it conveys its theme is very difficult, and reducing it to a surface level in order to critique it with more concrete terms doesn't do the level justice. One thing I've talked about a good amount in this video is progression, because a creator like KrmaL has insane potential to show this in more interesting and perhaps more abstract ways than a lot of others might think to. This is exemplified in Black Blizzard, because a lot of the ways this level progresses are so subtle that even watching it and playing it as much as I have, they didn't reveal themselves to me until I actively started looking for them. In particular, I want to focus on KrmaL's use of the color scheme to build tension and move between different parts of this level. This is accomplished through the contrast and the balance of black and white between parts. The first and third having a focus on darkness, while the second and fourth have their emphasis on white and grey. In the last part, there's almost a reunion of these two ideas. The white bar effects work in tandem with the darkness surrounding the player, while forming a contrast to the second half of the drop by retreating to the background to match the song. And smaller references to previous parts are made through the snow particles and hint of white on the stalactites. Even outside of deeper analysis, the use of light and dark to reflect the song is immensely creative within the individual parts, and the tension that it creates solely by virtue of saving its most grandiose and impactful set pieces and effects for the later parts of this level makes it thrilling to experience. It's also very easy to talk about the gameplay in relation to its effect on the progression. The fact that there are only 5 clear-cut parts with very infrequent game mode changes means that you can easily identify each section in your mind and gives the level character, along with just showing that you don't actually need to change the player's game mode every second in order to make engaging gameplay. As to be expected, a lot of the value of this gameplay comes from the way it combines its game mode selection with orbs and portals to create unique momentum. And despite some spots feeling a little janky in the way they were constructed, the level is still incredibly satisfying to pull off. Getting to the jewels even in a run is some of the most intense fun you can get in this game. The overall effect of the progression at various levels of depth is that Black Blizzard feels like an incredibly well-rounded and satisfying experience, along with conveying its concept in a way that sets it apart from any other themed levels, even the ridiculously polished ones of today. And I think this might be the core reason as to why I and many others like KrmaL's work as much as we do. The level of innovation that levels like LitFuse and Black Blizzard provided at the time gave them immense popularity and means they have aged incredibly well. Even with his most recent project, KrmaL has shown that he's still capable of thinking outside the box and achieving his aims. And even if he doesn't release another solo for a good while, the influence of his levels will undoubtedly be felt through the more actively experimental side of the community for years to come.